So in your book, you say all policies have a symbolic side, but symbolic policy is something different. Could you explain
Yes.
in simple terms what makes a policy symbolic rather than just plain political communication or PR?
Okay. Um, the, um, the point of the book is to insist on the fact that in the last decades, when political scientists have looked at public policy, they have focused on material effects and on the material dimension of policy, and they have overlooked the fact that beyond this material dimension, any policy is full of meanings that are understood by the people who receive the policy. And these meanings are articulated through symbols that are used when developing this policy, that are read and decrypted in a way by people. For instance, when and the other point I need to add is that political scientists have neglected the fact that policymakers are aware of how people read are likely to read the policies. So, for instance, when in France in 2015 there were terrorist attacks, the government decided, amongst other things, to deploy the military in the streets, and in particular to protect synagogues and other places, religious places. And the reason for doing that was not solely that it would in fact indeed deter potential terrorists, but that it would be seen by the French population as the state being present to defend them. So what was important for the government was to be seen to be defending just as much as the fact that it was indeed ready for such an attack. So it's not that symbolic policies are different from other policies, it's that we need to pay attention to the symbolic dimension of all policies. So that is the key argument.
I see. So, in practice, when a government makes an announcement, how do we know if it's really symbolic policy or just publicity?
Um, the there is a communication, a publicity dimension when, as you said, the policy is being announced, but very often we fail to consider how the there's so there's the declaration, the announcement of we will invest, for instance, so many millions, and that is in terms of uh, communication, and it is in fact indeed something that is much sought by governments, and very often they repeat and appear to re-announce that money that they've already promised. However, what we also need to pay attention to is how the by announcing these investments, governments are focusing the attention of the population and the people who receive the policy on the priorities of government. So there is an effect in terms of bringing the attention of the population to these policies and giving them categories to analyze or to understand where are the priorities of the government. So it is more than just an announcement that we need to take into account. And also in the example that I was giving early on, you can see that it's beyond the announcement of the policy, it's the fact that citizens could see the presence of the military in the street that was important, right? So it's not just the publicity, it's the perception of what is being deployed.
I see. So you talked about the 2015 terror attacks in France, and like I mean, as far as I've read, that there were measures that were both practical and symbolic that were implemented. Like, uh, if I've read correctly, Operation Sentinel. Were, there was Operation the troops patrolling the streets. They had a practical function, but also symbolic one. So,
Yes.
could you give an example of an action that worked on both levels?
You want another example?
Yes.
Um, I will take a quite different example, which would be when the government decides to change the level of taxation of depending on the levels of either income or assets that are being owned. And the fact, for instance, um, the rising of let's imagine of the last band of taxation on um, beyond a certain level of wealth will be seen not only as something that can increase indeed the income for the state in terms of the extra funds gained from taxing this last upper band of wealth, but it can also be used, or it can be seen as um, a measure that contributes to redirect or to equilibrate the burden of taxation between the different social categories, and in particular between the rich and the middle classes. So it would have both a practical effect in terms of getting more money into the coffers of the state, but it would also it can also be seen as changing the burden of funding the state by recalibrating it towards the rich.
I see. So I'll be coming towards the COVID pandemic. So during the COVID pandemic, leaders used a lot of metaphors, like calling it a war, or asking people to flatten the curve. Which kinds
Mhm.
of words or images do you find really changed how people behaved?
Um, the, um, the COVID was very interesting because all governments, and it allows us to compare how all governments were trying to communicate um, what they were doing and trying to get consent, assent, and obedience in a way from the population. And they were addressing directly not just to the chattering classes, those who listen to the news, but they were really also trying to be understood by the wider population. And so they try to simplify the language and to communicate also in ways that could be easily understood. Um, and to explain how, so you talk about flattening the curve, which is a very a very clear image, but other aspects can be can be mentioned. For instance, when governments, prime ministers, and so on, and their ministers started appearing to give interviews, even sometimes when they were very far away from journalists, when they were outside, that there was no risk of contamination. They appeared wearing masks. In some cases, at the very beginning, you could even see them on Zoom with photographs taken to be circulated in the press on Zoom, but with masks on. And
Yes,
that was a way to clearly say to the population, not only masks are good for the people, it's also important that we do the same thing.
I see. And like in our country, this is India,
Yeah.
the prime minister uh, I guess it was the first year of the pandemic. The Prime Minister said, I mean, asked everyone to, at a certain time during the evening, to come to their terrace and to, just celebrate Diwali.
Yeah.
When it, and I mean, it was rather funny and comedic because it certainly, at that time in my mind, it did nothing. I mean, it was fun, but I guess it surely did had a lot of you know effect
I think,
on the German
yeah,
populace.
yeah, this is a very good example, and I didn't know that, but it's very similar to some of the practices that were um, supported, if not created, by European governments, which is the ones I know. So very similarly um, to, for instance, the French were called to clap, so to
Yes.
applaud at their balcony, the Italians sang, and so on. So what this was important for, and as you say yourself, you noticed that it was fun, but it was also a way to make everybody participate. So everybody could be part of the collective, and that contributed symbolically to make this collective exist. So it doesn't, it lasted not necessarily for a very long time beyond these moments when this period of lockdown in particular. Nevertheless, it was important because it helped everybody actually understand that I'm part of this, just as you felt that, you were part of this.
Yeah. uh, and do you think that some metaphors can actually hurt trust depending on the culture or the country?
I'm sorry, what depending, I didn't hear the beginning.
Do you think some metaphors can actually hurt trust depending on the culture or the country?
Um, the As you could see with the example of clapping or Diwali, the measures that will speak to a population differ from one country to another. So clearly, French people will uh, understand messages differently from what Indians would understand from what their government is actually doing. If only because a lot of the symbols that can be used, such as a reference to the history of the country, a reference to important figures in the history of the country, or important places, they differ from one country to the next. Does that answer your question? Because I wasn't sure I actually heard it very well.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
So each country has its own repertoire of symbols, which means that um, it's important for a government to actually understand its culture, its population, what is shared by people in its own country, so that it can better adapt the message that it's giving to them, how it speaks to the population.
I see. So, when you study symbolism and policy, what do you look at? Is it, speeches, rituals, body language, or media coverage, etc., etc.?
There are different ways of looking at the symbolic dimension of public policy. What I have done with my colleague is we had opportunities to look at how governments themselves decided what they decided to use and how they decided to use it. And that was because we had an opportunity to go and interview advisors around the French government in the post terrorist attacks in 2015. But we also looked during COVID. We actually looked at the speeches, at the most governments, most presidents, and I imagine that would have been the same in India, gave televised and radio speeches to address the population, and that was something that was broadcast very broadly, particularly important for people who were starting lockdown. So in this case, we looked at the speeches, both the text of the speech, the metaphors, the arguments that they use, but also how the speech is staged, because both are actually decrypted, understood, and communicate slightly different things to the
Hmm.
population. So, for instance, if we take a televised speech, and I will take the French example, but if you give me, examples on what happened in India, I can also comment on them. But in the French case, the French president spoke from the Élysée, which is from the Élysée Palace, which is quite customary, but spoke from his office, and the staging with all the decor, with the gold of the palace, actually is a way to say, look, I'm important, I'm the French president, I represent you. So this setting in which he spoke, but also the tone of his voice, the way he addressed, looking straight into the eyes of the population and so on, is a way to uh, convey the authority of the message that is being articulated, and to really kind of catch the attention of the population. So you can look at the staging, the tone, the acting, the body behavior of the speaker, and then you can look at the content of his speech. And in the case of COVID, and in particular in the second speech that he gave, the president talked a lot, used a lot of war metaphor. So he made reference to the Second World War as a time when French people got together. He used also reference to uh, um, a kind of agreement that the French resistance had to govern after the war. All this to remind and make French people think about times of solidarity, times of really struggle, when actually the country collectively won and recovered. So if we in this case, the French president was able to use the Second World War to make French people understand that it's a bad period of time, but if we work together, we exit the situation together. Of course, if we then compare that to other countries such as Germany, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel could not talk about the war because it's full of bad memories, and as you
Hmm.
can understand. So
Yes.
she used other metaphors, and in particular in her case, because she's a scientist, she really focused on the science about the epidemic. So you can see how, while saying the same thing, we need to be together, we need to exert solidarity so that we protect vulnerables and we prevent uh, the disease from spreading, and we get out of this situation. They used different ways to address their population because the population would not have responded to the same way, or so they thought. And the fact that that's the choice they made is what is important. The French president and his team decided that the best way for French people to understand the situation and solidarity was to talk about the war, whilst in Germany they made different choices.
I see. So, could we say that, like, symbolic policies, the aim, one of the main aims of symbolic policy is to make sure that uh, the the message is easier to get.
Yes, what is also important, so that's when the government is really focused on and aware of the fact that the symbolic dimension of its policy will need to be understood in the way they are happy with, that they want the message to be understood. But we can imagine that the government does not pay sufficient attention to how the policy will be understood. And they think maybe that the only thing that matters is that it is it will have an economic impact, for instance, or an impact on I'll take the example of carbon emission and policies to limit carbon emissions to combat climate change, to mitigate climate change. Based on information from scientists and from economists, some of the policies that have been thought of as helpful is to tax carbon, to tax the use of fuel, of petrol, of gasoline. So it's carbon taxed. And the idea is that when the price goes up, that's, for instance, already a symbol. When the price goes up, it has an economic impact, i.e. people are less able to afford the gasoline, but also it sends a signal, an economic signal, in terms of reduction of the use. But these policies, we have noticed in France in particular, how they are received very negatively by the population, and in particular, in some cases, by the population in rural France. So whilst the policies were acceptable by people who live in cities, they were not accepted in the same way by people who live far away from cities. And in some cases, there were rebellions against such policies, and the government eventually climbed down on the policy. And if we look at the way the rural population, or the population who mobilized against this carbon policy, what they say, they argued that it was a policy that was designed to, that in effect would privilege those who live in cities, who do not need cars because there's public transport. And therefore, that what they perceived in this policy was that it was a policy for the benefit of the rich, because it would actually impact them, rural population who are dependent on individual transport, on cars, much harder. And they saw a difference between people who they consider to be the people versus the urban elites. So symbolically, these carbon taxing policies were perceived as creating inequality between rich people from cities and poorer population from rural France. So this was not a message that was anticipated by the government, but this one can consider that this is how it was perceived by rural population, and this is how it was also then used by opposition political parties to say this is a policy of inequality between urban and rural population.
I see. So, before you talked about, like, you said that technically each country has its own set of symbols that the leaders can draw on, like a repertoire of rituals or metaphors. So, can these be created from scratch?
Can one create a ritual from scratch?
Yes.
You could, yes and no. But the example that we had earlier on about Diwali during COVID, or the clapping, both of these, in a way, were inventions, but they used something that people could understand. So, celebrating light and solidarity and so on is something that Indian people could understand, and therefore it could be transposed. So you use to make something from scratch, you nevertheless need to have elements that people can understand. So if I take the example of how after the first attack in 2015 against Charlie Hebdo, when the journalists were killed, and the French government contributed to the organization of a very, very long march in Paris, but also in the rest of France. When they did so, they were using practices that are very easily understood by French citizens, because there's a long tradition of demonstrations and marches. But they were also creating something new, because they wanted everybody to join and not just the left. Usually the left is more prone to demonstration and the right doesn't. The right understand what a demonstration is, but usually doesn't do it. But they wanted really to make sure that there were people who were supporters of Charlie Hebdo, or people who were just who were critical of the terrorist attacks. So they banned all expression of public opinion, of political positions, and they asked the march to be silent, which is quite unusual. So here you have an invention, a silent march, but they get it also, the idea of silence is to make sure that you can't be against the speech that has been articulated at the march. And this idea comes from something quite different, which is the silent marches that are sometimes organized when somebody has been killed, in particular children. When children have been killed, they are silent marches. So here you conflate the big political rally that comes from the left, but also this idea of vigils and silent marches. And the fact that the government, the president himself, called all French people to take part was also very new. It had never happened before. So you see here there are dimensions that are invented, and others that mean something for the people who are supposed to take part.
Well, about protests, do you think the the government should look at them as their quote unquote enemy, or sh- I mean, they, at least in my country, they do. Should they look at protests, peaceful protests, as their enemies, or just as a piece of criticism?
So because the sound was, there were interruptions, I'm just repeating the question to make sure I understand. Should the government consider marches as protests, as critical of them? Is that your question?
Yes, should they consider them as criticisms, or as, as an inherent enemy of the state, the marches and stuff?
Oh, it really depends on the march. In the example I was giving of the march after Charlie Hebdo on the 11th of January 2015, the government itself had called for the march. Clearly, the marchers were not critical of the government.
Yes.
One can, in most cases, when there are marches, there are groups that organize and call for the mobilization of people to go in the streets. And they give messages and they say why the people are being mobilized and why they are marching. So the government can see there whether it is critical or not of its action. So, very often when there are demonstrations, the political message is very explicit. One can very well imagine that there are marches that can be in support of the government. And I will take another French example, much older one. But after the the student mobilizations in 1968. There had been confrontations between the students and the police. So clearly, in this case, they were critical of the government. But after this student protest, at some point, the French president and the French government asked people, and the political parties that supported him asked people to go and march in support of the government. And there was a very, very big march of people supporting the government to say we want the end of the student rebellion of 1968. And then they organized elections. So it
See.
depends.
So, well, in your view, what makes symbolic policy effective and meaningful, and what makes it just an empty gesture?
There are there are policies that are meant to distract attention. So we are not denying that in some cases there are policies that are thought of as a way to make believe that that the government pays attention to a problem, even if it's not.
Yes.
And sometimes there are empty promises. For instance, in Italy, there was after a terrible earthquake in Assisi, in the middle of Italy, the government made promises that it would rebuild. It was focused on it, that it would rebuild the town of Assisi very quickly, and that allowed the attention of the population, both in Assisi and beyond, to think, okay, the government is now in charge and the situation will improve for the people who've had their houses destroyed. But what we see in this case is that the government did not invest resources to respond to the situation. And a year later, and a few years down the line, the population of Assisi could see that nothing had been done. But for what was important from the point of view of the government was that the population of Italy had moved on and was not any longer focusing on the distress of people in the town. So there are policies that are indeed developed to distract attention. But the point is that all policies, even when they are not meant to detract, are also meaningful. They are also understood by population. As in the examples I gave you about, for instance, the carbon tax, the policy would have had an effect on reducing the consumption of gasoline and therefore of the emission of carbon in the atmosphere. Yet the message that people who protested against them understood was not just it will be good for the environment and for climate because it will reduce the emission of carbon. What they actually understood is this policy is an example of inequalities between urban elites and rural populations, and this policy is good for elites in cities and bad for rural population, who are those who suffer and will suffer more. So it's important to actually take into account the fact that even that all policies have a symbolic dimension, and the symbolic dimension sometimes is consciously worked on by the authorities, by the government. And when they do not pay attention to the message that is being conveyed by their policy, to how the policy is going to be received, they may be shocked to realize when there is a protest that the policy was understood very differently from what they intended.
I see. Uh,
You,
s-
yeah.
uh, so, is there any? I mean, how can we actually tell if symbolic policies are actually working? Are there any, concrete ways to measure their effects?
Mm. Um, Again, I would not necessarily say that. Uh, well, what I would say is that it's usually very difficult to measure as such because the tools that we have for measuring um, cannot actually really see what is happening in the minds or in the understanding, in the meanings that are understood by the population, except so you would have to do surveys, but you would have to actually asking the questions, and the timing of the question is very difficult to organize for it to demonstrate to you whether the message has worked or not. You can see whether the message has worked, whether it has been perceived in a good way. In part, for instance, by one could almost say, in some cases, lack of protest, acceptance of the policy, um, or because the conflicts that you were expecting did not happen. So if we go back to the March of 2015 that I talked about in France,
Hmm.
the French government was very worried that there would be inter-community fights between the Muslim population and those who considered that because the terrorists used Islam as a motivation for their crime, that they would actually consider that all Muslims were guilty. So the march and making everybody participate and feel that they belong to France was a way to make people forget that there are differences between the communities within France and to feel one. Because there were no fights, the government considered that actually they had succeeded in their symbolic message of unity of the French population. So that would be one way of measuring or assessing rather than measuring whether it happened. Um, an example, there's a very rare example of how we can measure the impact of, for instance, a speech. And it's a study that was done because by chance there were um, panel surveys of French people, and one of the waves of survey was straddled what happened at the same time and was scheduled to happen at the same time as the speech of President Macron during COVID.
Hmm.
It was serendipity that it was done like that. But what it meant is that the data that was collected, some of the respondents did the survey before the speech by Macron, and some of the people responded just before, or it was a 24 hours or maybe 36 hours of open to do the survey. And what the colleague who worked on that was able to show was that, and there were questions about COVID, about whether you're more likely to wash your hands, whether whether you feel what's happening, and so on. What my colleague was able to show was that those who responded after the speech were much more prone to say, yes, I'm going to wash my hands. Yes, they were much keener to actually do the actions that the president had talked about in his speech than those who had not watched the speech yet because it had not happened. But that's a rare example. I know that some colleagues are trying to prepare for cases of emergency where they have questionnaires ready to go to the field so that they can reproduce in a way this capacity to measure the impact very close to the moment. But normally one doesn't predict an earthquake a flood, and so on. So it's difficult to actually have a precise measure of how populations understand the message of the government.
Uh, and like apart from terror attacks or crisis or pandemics, where do you see symbolic policy being really important? Like for example, do you think policies around education or climate change are becoming more and more symbolic? Like you talked about the yellow vest protests, etc., etc.
It just happened that the situations I worked on were crises, and it was convenient because it kind of focuses the attention. However, our argument is really that all policies have a symbolic dimension, and that we need to pay attention to the symbolic dimension to understand how people respond to the policy, are more prone to accept the policy, and how the policy is transforming the population on which it applies. It is not that policies are becoming more symbolic, they have always been a symbolic dimension of policy. It is just that we have not paid attention to it because we were more focused on looking at the economic impact, the material impact, the transformation of the administration, for instance, and so on. So we were looking at something else than the meaning that is understood by the population or the targets of these policies. What may happen is that for a time, as observers were more focused on the material economic dimensions, politicians maybe, or at least the policy makers, not necessarily the politicians themselves, who are usually very acutely aware of how their voters are likely to respond, but bureaucrats may have paid less attention to the symbolic dimension because they were focused on the economic effects, for instance, and maybe they are now understanding a little more that it is important to understand how citizens will understand the policy and will react emotionally, whether they will feel part of a community that benefits from the policy, or a community, or identify as a community that will be a victim of the policy. And that's where, for any policy, whether it's a farming policy, whether it's a transport policy, and so on, the understanding and by the population of whether they are beneficiaries or losers, whether it makes them, it valorizes them, and so on, is important. So this symbolic dimension is always present.
See, and finally, what advice would you give governments about using, symbolism responsibly in an ethical way so that it helps society rather than manipulates it?
It's a difficult question because one should always expect our politicians to actually govern for the public good, and thinking about not manipulating and tricking people in a way. But I think that in many cases they do. And one could. So I think my advice would be more on focusing on trying to understand how the population and different groups in the population, how they are equipped to understand and to make sense of the policy that is being developed. And what is very difficult in contemporary society is that there are so many voices with the in particular with social media, but with the development of communication and the media sphere in general, it makes it very difficult for the government's voice to be heard and to be the only one, or to be the dominant one to be heard. And they have to deal with the fact that there are many voices, many more voices than in the past, that are heard by the population. If we go back 50 years, or even less than that, but let's say 50 years, population in, they would hear the voice of the government, maybe the voice of the local government and, their locality, but they would not be deluged by information coming from the social media on their phone, giving alternative interpretations of what the government is doing. So that's the real challenge for the government, and it is how to try to tailor the policy so that the message is understood in a manner that is aligned with what they conceive to be the public interest. After that, politically, it will depend on the coalition in government, and people will disagree with what is the collective good or not.
I see. So, do you think there's a clear line between a quote-unquote good symbolic politics and manipulative politics, or is it always blurred?
So between symbolic politics and which one?
I mean, good symbolic politics and manipulative politics.
Ah, um, um, it's a normative question that you are asking, and it's very difficult to respond in the abstract like that. I mean, I think clearly the the ways in which using the symbolic allows to convey messages to the population can be used both ways. In a way, it depends on the intention. I'm not sure I can answer your question in the abstract. It's a question of how you assess the normative, the moral intentions of the government in question. So and it depends. So there's not the evaluation of a symbolic of the symbolic effect, of the symbolic potency of the policy can be normatively evaluated, but that depends on the person who's doing the evaluation.